Welcome, everyone, to the C-Suite Sales and Marketing Perspective Podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And today, we've got a super interesting guest, David Roberts. And David, your background is very interesting. You've got a lot of accolades. I mean, you're a 3-time B2B CEO. You're a 2-time Chief Operating Officer, Chief Services Officer. You were a partner at Accenture. You spent 17 years there. But I'm going to let you explain. You took a interesting path and deviation in your career, and you worked for the mayor of Denver. But I'm going to let you tell a little bit about that and why, because it was all about serving the customer. And that's our main theme today, is that a customer retention strategy, a customer, cross-sell, upsell, expansion strategy, making loyalty the true engine of growth in our business is something that we all know that we should be doing. And Accenture and a number of the big consulting firms have covered that territory well. But we spend so much time and effort developing new logos, and that developing new pipeline, the amount of time we spend on that versus the time dedicated to understanding and expanding our current customers is probably a little bit off base. So we're going to go down that path pretty big time today. But I'd love to just ask you if you wouldn't mind maybe expanding a little bit more on your background before we get started.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. It's great to be with you. And I love the topic. Customers are at the heart of what we do here at Sugar. And it's been really a theme throughout my entire career. I started in Accenture's CRM practice and was part of that practice for 17 years. What's a little unusual is I was recruited away as a partner at Accenture to help the mayor of Denver, a guy named John Hickenlooper, take more of a customer orientation to the way the city ran its operations and its services. And the Chief Services Officer, the title was really something that John created to focus on how we engage the residents of Denver and make them feel like the city cared about how we supported them. So I did that for a few years. I probably would have stayed longer. He went on to be governor, and now he's one of our senators from Colorado, but that was a little bit different. Since then, I've been back in the private sector and focused on, as you said, B2B software businesses, and it's been a fantastic ride.
Here's what I'd love to do. I'd love to have you maybe kind of take us through the experiences in your career that have really developed the way that you think about customers and creating long-term growth today. So I think it's just fascinating.
Yeah, I think it all starts for me from my time at Accenture. I still say we when I talk about Accenture a bit because it was it's where I grew up professionally. And I'm not even sure how this happens or process. It's not like we went through training at Accenture on this necessarily, but we always were walking the halls at our customer, and our ability to grow and expand was based on that trust, the view that we were critical to those customers' businesses. I remember running into an IBM global services person that said, we're so jealous of Accenture's ability just to be able to walk the halls in the Fortune 500 businesses around the world and be that trusted advisor. And I was raised by parents who didn't love the idea of me walking around the neighborhood and reselling candy bars or doing things for fundraising. So it wasn't really part of how I was brought up, but selling became easy when all you were doing is helping customers be successful with their objectives. So I think the roots of that customer obsession, that focus on customer, came from the culture that I was part of for the first 17 years of my career.
Here's what's interesting is we have more data about the customer than we've ever had before. And it's really important. But what you're talking about there is one-on-one interactions, actually living with your customers. I was just listening to a podcast and it talked about how the gentleman, extraordinarily successful online, I won't mention his name, but he literally had a mentor that came and said, I want to sit with you for a day. I want to understand how you operate, how you think, how you problem solve, what you do in order to really be a good mentor for you. And what you just described there is to be a really good trusted advisor. You've got to really understand at a deep innate level your customers and how they think and how they live and what they fear and what they think are the biggest opportunities. It's interesting because all of the big consulting firms have said this is important, but they have all said that literally, I think this was a report that came out in 2023, less than 15% of companies actually activate the voice of the customer in their business. Right? So This seems like a marketing 101. It seems like a growth strategy 101. Know your customer and know them innately. But why do you think that most companies don't understand their customer at the level that you wanted to, that you enjoyed when you were at Accenture and you've taken now on throughout your career?
I'll give you two answers or stories about this. First, I think we talk a lot in sales training, and we're a CRM company, so we talk a lot about helping salespeople be better as account managers and as salespeople. And a lot of sales organizations focus on the back half of the pipeline, right? Like how you go from negotiating to closing to signing and working deals at the back half of the pipeline. I think what matters, what scales, is focus on the front half. And usually in all sales processes, there's an initial sales stage called discovery or discover or learn or something like this. And I think the best salespeople are really curious about two things. They're really curious about the business. They want to understand the business. We'll often say on good discovery calls, you should be listening about 80% of the time and talking 20% of the time. So curious about the business and then curious about the person. I think in business, sometimes we don't want to be vulnerable. We don't want to talk about the challenges, what scares us, what we're worried about. If you ask, people will tell you. And I think being curious about the person and being curious about the business is kind of the fundamental foundation of being customer oriented. And then I could talk a little bit about the voice of the customer and how that can be activated, but let me pause there for a minute.
Though I would love to do that because, it was interesting. I had a woman on the podcast recently and she's 3-time B2B CMO, some of the biggest Fortune 500 companies around. And she said, Steve, all I want to do on your podcast is talk about one thing. Okay, well, what's that? She goes, well, this is the lack of execution. It's where all good strategy goes to die. So I would love to, learn from you, from Accenture. You were at a company, talk to us a little bit. You were at a company that literally was a voice of the customer company, right? I mean, this is not something that you haven't thought through. And then now you're leading a company that's a CRM, SugarCRM, right? And taking the voice of the customer and activating it in the sales process is what a good CRM is all about. So I would love to hear your thoughts on how you activate the voice of the customer.
Well, I love your guest comments because execution is what matters. I often describe myself as a mechanical strategist, meaning I love strategy. I love getting up on whiteboards. I've got one right behind me that I'm using all the time. But unless you can figure out the mechanics of the execution that support that strategy, it becomes theoretical. And businesses do need to figure out how they execute on that. So the example, everybody's probably heard of Net Promoter Score, something invented by a partner at Bain many, many years ago. And it's super simple. It asks people how likely you are to recommend a company or a service. And it's on a scale of 1 to 10. 9s and 10s are promoters, 1 through 6 detractors, and you got some passives in between. And I remember interviewing when I was running Alchemer. Alchemer is a voice of the customer company, a survey company. And I was interviewing CFOs years ago. And I used to ask every one of them, have you heard of NPS? Of course, I've heard of NPS. Great. How do you use it? We present our NPS score to the entire company at the all hands meeting once a quarter. I'm like, great. And then what? And they're like, we refresh it every quarter and we present it at the next meeting. Fundamentally, that doesn't do anything to move the needle. What we talked a lot about at Alchemer, and it's absolutely what we do at Sugar, is we take the top promoters, the 9s and 10s, and we engage them into marketing cadences. Those are the people who are fierce advocates. They want to go tell the world how much they love sugar. So we take those 9s and 10s and we ask them to go share their love for sugar with the world. We take the detractors, who are the 1 through 6s, and we say, usually in the verbatims, they'll tell you why they're unhappy. And you can turn that into a supportable event. We actually turn that into a support case, and we reach out to those customers and we try to engage them in whatever's got them concerned. And then the passives, and here's the funny thing about passives, promoters and detractors renew at a higher rate than passives. That's a little like counterintuitive. You'd think passives would be higher than detractors, but it's the old thing people have always said, love me or hate me, just don't ignore me. Those passives don't renew as well. So we take the passives and we send them off to our customer success team, and we ask them to go engage them proactively and try to turn them from passives into promoters, right? So each one of those in the simplest of frameworks, that simple NPS framework, can be used to drive marketing cadences, support cadences, customer success cadences to engage customers and make them feel like you've really heard them when you've asked them for their opinion.
So Two things I want to ask you from it's just amazing. A, just as an observation, you activated your NPS score, right? You created follow-up conversations, you engaged, you learned, but at the same time, you're turning detractors into more revenue. You're retaining them. I mean, we all need to track our NRR scores, right? We need to make sure that we're retaining customers, but we're expanding them. So you're engaging. That's the first thing. Like you're actively having conversations with all of these folks rather than a survey that goes out and we take a look at the results, which is important, but you took it to the next level. The next thing that I really took away from this is you started taking those 9s and 10s and engaging them and activating them through your outbound marketing campaigns. And there was a brilliant woman that came on the podcast about a year and a half ago. And she said, Steve, she goes, bottom line is every time the voice of the customer precedes ours, it worked better. That's the trusted peer community of the people that we're selling to. We got skin in the game, right? We're a selling organization. So no matter what, and you don't have to go farther than the LinkedIn Edelman Trust Barometer to see that as an industry, we have some pretty major trust issues. No matter who we each individually are, we're all lumped together, right? And we're not trusted. So we need to be replacing our sales strategy in a lot of ways with indications of that can be trusted, right? And the people that are doing the same kind of jobs that we are, it's one of the top ways that we look for validation and how we're going to move forward. So I love that you're taking something that in a lot of organizations is kind of a survey that ends up on the server and a bunch of data that doesn't really get activated. And that's something that you and I talked a lot about before, which is you talked about, you're a software company, right? That a lot of organizations and leaders see that like, hey, as soon as I turn on this software, that's what's going to really make the difference, right? That's what I need to solve all my problems. But you have a very different point of view on that I wanted to talk about.
Well, it might be odd coming from a software executive that software isn't the solution to all your problems. It absolutely can be. But this is from my Accenture days, through my time at the city, through all the companies I've run. People think that they go buy software and it solves the problem. Fundamentally, if like you don't understand how your processes are built to serve your customers, if you don't understand the data that's required to be able to either guide that process or report on its impact, the software isn't gonna get you anywhere, right? So we used to talk forever ago at Accenture about people, process, and technology. The technology piece can allow you to drive efficiency and go faster, but if it's a messy, broken process, it's gonna allow you to speed up your time to a bad destination, right? So even with my teams today, when they're like, we'd like to use some additional software, I'd say, great, like what's got to be in place before we go talk about implementing software to help us perform better. And we at Sugar want to do that with our customers. We really want them to understand the business value they're trying to drive, the data that's required, the business process that's required to go make an account management process work better, a customer service process work better, a sales or forecasting process work better. And then our software does a phenomenal job of helping you automate, and especially we'll get into AI a bit, but like leverage the power of technology to do it better.
Interesting to kind of a backdrop to what you're saying here is I went in a couple of weeks ago and just asked ChatGPT, what are the top 5 reasons why businesses don't use the LLM like ChatGPT correctly? 85, 90%, whatever the number is of AI implementations don't work, right? So I was like, hey, why? A couple of things that came out that you just talked about there. Fragmented, siloed data, right? If you don't have the right data feeding the machine, right, then like the best AI tool, the best CRM out there that has all the AI components, if it doesn't have the right information being fed into it, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter, right? They talked about not well-defined use cases. So in other words, what do we really want this tool to use? And that's one of the biggest things with AI right now is the hype. It's just like, I need it. So I know you've been asked by the board. I'm sure you have. What's your AI strategy, David, right? And you probably turned around and appropriately asked your CMO, your CRO, hey, what's our AI strategy? Because we better have one without saying, what do we need to do and how can AI help us? We're kind of the cart leading the horse, right?
Yeah. Let me share a little bit about that. First, as a guy who's been in CRM for 30 years, there's been this promise of CRM, right? That sellers will get more value out than they put into it. And I don't think we still are yet to crack that code. One of my engineers said to me a while ago, structured data is the language of business and unstructured data is the language of relationships. Again, AI presents enormous promise of us helping understand the language of relationship, unstructured data fundamentally. But I think we take technologies that we use in our personal lives and we think we're going to apply them to our business lives. And this ask me anything kind of metaphor, I don't believe is the right strategy for AI within business. I think it's got to be highly context driven. And that context is business process, the data, the content that really helps guide these LLMs to meaningfully support, in our case, sellers in their sales processes. I think I said to you on the pre-call, Steve, that I joke about the ABCs of intelligence, right? There's artificial intelligence. Everyone's talking about AI. There's business intelligence. A decade ago, everyone was talking about BI, and they're still talking about analytics and insights that are driven by BI. I talk a lot about CI, which is contextual intelligence. And if we can take AI and BI and put it in the context of a sales process, in the context of a sales methodology, in the context of what we know about a customer, we can have a huge impact using those technologies. But absent that, an ask me anything kind of approach without putting the work in to provide these LLMs with the context they need to be helpful is probably more distracting or more of a science experiment than it is a real business, a valuable business tool.
Here's what's so interesting about this. I'm sure when you were at Accenture, the whole big wave was digital transformation. Like the difference between the business of today and the business of tomorrow is data, right? And how we digitize and utilize that data and put the data into the hands of the teams, right? The execution, high performance teams. Well, here we are, how many decades later? And now we're still talking about the same issue, right? And AI has put a whole new level on. I mean, nobody talked about digital transformation the way we're talking about AI, right? It was going to change the world, but not at the level of AI, right? So when are we going to learn? Like, what are the fundamentals? What are the building blocks that you've learned from being a partner at Accenture, three-time B2B CEO about digital transformation, AI, the importance of data, the importance of customers? Like, what's the foundation? What's the lessons that we need to learn here that really get us to that contextual intelligence? Like, what do we need to do that we're not doing today?
I think actually we always learn a lesson. These cycles, in my experience, follow a similar pattern, right? If I go back to the very early days of CRM, people are like, we're going to install CRM and sales are going to get better immediately, right? And then out of the gate, some of these projects didn't go very well. I remember one of my clients in the early days said they were probably 3 or 4 years into the CRM cycle. And they said, we're going to approach this differently. We're going to spend a whole bunch of time before we ever show, back then it was Siebel, a Siebel screen. We're going to go and we're going to inform everyone on what a good sales process looks like, what good entrance and exit criteria look like, how we actually drive solution selling for their business. They spent a bunch of time working on that before they ever turned on the Siebel screens. And they were way more successful than the people who took a different approach years earlier. You look at the internet, I lived through the dot-com bubble, as many of us did. Same sort of thing. The hype got ahead of the execution. Stocks, I remember the former CEO of Accenture went to go start a company called Webvan, and they were going to go deliver groceries. The idea was right. And many of us have groceries delivered to our front porch today. It's done in a different way with different companies who actually figured out some of the prerequisites required to make that work. And today, I think with AI, it's the same thing. I think people are learning. I think you're going to see the technology, the processing power is what makes all this possible. Data centers and chips, and that's what makes all this possible. And I think we'll see, just like every other time, we'll see the business practices catch up, the context catch up with the technology. And I'm super optimistic about lots of things, but we'll see that happen again here over the next few years as businesses figure out how to leverage the power of AI.
So right now, AI is a double-edged sword, right? It's flooding the internet with content. Yet we're trying to build trust. In B2B, it's all about relationships. It's all about the foundation of trust, right? Yet now in content, go back to like the Foresters of the world, like the underpinnings of ABM is content, right? Because yeah, it's the way that we get known, we get discovered. Absolutely. So now we've got this flood of AI created content out there, and it's confusing and it's not personalized always. It's more genericized. And so AI can, in the right way, with the right data and the right tools, be something that is absolutely does what we've all wanted. Hyper personalized ABM motions, right? That's the way the world goes, right? So that's kind of the promise of AI and what we're doing. But at the moment, it's almost eroding trust because it's just flooding, right? It's flooding the internet with content. So what does it take to use AI and the recommendations that come out of AI to build trust behind our go-to-market motions and our sellers?
Yeah. I think the answer is again, context. I mean, if you go out and we're all using Google differently than we used to, right? We used to put in 3 words that would prompt search. I just put a ski rack on my car this weekend. In the old days, I would have put in best ski racks and then Google would have returned some things. Now what AI is training me to do is say, what's the best ski rack that I should use with a factory OEM Bronco ski rack? Right? Like we're putting a lot more in because we can get a lot more out. So we're investing the time to do that. But what Google does is they give you all sorts of links where you can click in, right? In the AI summary, you can click in to actually understand why they said that, where it came from, the transparency, the backing up its recommendations is what builds trust, for me anyway, in what Google's returning in an AI summary. To use a business context example, Sugar's investing really heavily in being able to guide sellers to the right next activities, right? So if we, for example, put a prompt up there that says, the following customer is reducing its spend with these products, sellers are going to wonder, like, why do you think that? Show me. If you're an account manager and you want to really engage that customer and you don't want to look stupid, you don't want to follow up with the customer and say something that erodes trust with your customer. You're going to want to know what's being shown to you is based on like facts and data. So the same kind of principle applies. We want to be able to click in and say that recommendation came because Sugar ingested tons of order data about the customer. We can show what that buying process has been, what that buying cycle's been, and we can guide the seller back to the underlying evidence that makes the recommendations feel trustworthy, right? So I think that context, backing it up, showing the kind of back in the old days when you and I were writing papers in college, they always said, cite your sources. Nothing's changed there. We've got to cite our sources when it comes to AI.
It goes back to, it's like a framework, right? Like we've got to validate, we've got to prove. We can't just say this is the way that it is, right? We need to back up what we're doing. And if we do that, and we can be relied on to do that, then that's going to build trust, immensely amount of trust. I love that you're trying to create that framework inside of Sugar. Here's what I'd love to do in the time that we have left here. I'd love for you to take us through the path of activated customer feedback as kind of a way to end this, because we talked about at the very, very beginning of this conversation is that loyalty is the new growth engine, right? So if you were to kind of say, hey, here's what you need to know, right? Loyalty, your customer base is the new growth engine. What do you want to leave us with? What do you want us to know to make sure that we're taking the right things away?
I think to connect a couple dots from our conversation, Steve, like you talk about execution, I think we've just redefined our core values at Sugar, and the number one value is all about customer. We're a CRM business. We're focused on the customer. Like everything you do has to back that up, and customers have to see that you're doing that. In software businesses, there's a lot of TLAs or 3-letter acronyms that we like to throw around. And there's a lot of metrics that tell you whether a software business is doing well or not. One of them is GRR, which is gross retention rate. One of them is NRR, which is net retention rate. The biggest thing you can do in a software business is have a really strong gross and net retention. And we're lucky that we do here at Sugar. And it's because we try to show the customer through every part of that life cycle that we're doing things to support their journey, right? This customer journey management is a little bit of a buzzword, a little bit of a buzz phrase. But if you're thinking about like how, when you go from a sales process and somebody trusts you to purchase your software, how do you make sure that like the engagement and the implementation backs up what the seller told you? How do you make sure once the customer's gone live, that you're helping them through the adoption process and that they're starting to use that software effectively? How do you make sure that if they make a support call into your organization, that your primary objective is to get the problem addressed as quickly as possible and to solve the root cause? That means no one else has to call about that customer, about that same problem. Like that whole journey management, people talk about it a lot. We at Sugar as an executive team talk about making sure that every part of our business is focused on not only solving the instance, but solving the root cause of the issue that is maybe negatively impacting that customer journey. And it's just like that activated NPS example. It shows the customer that if they're going to bother telling you about what's going on, if they're going to bother engaging with you, that you're going to listen and you're going to do something about it. It's really not rocket science. It's just being customer obsessed and following through, making sure the customers see and hear you, acting against that value.
It's interesting. There's not a company out there that wouldn't say, yeah, we're not customer obsessed. We're not customer focused. We're not customer driven. Yeah, like everybody would say that, right? Yes. But to your point, it comes back to how do you execute on that? How do you actually activate the voice of the customer? And when I read that survey from a couple of years ago that less than 15% companies actually activate it, we've just spent the last half hour talking about it's the number one thing we need to be doing.
Right. A lot of companies, even though they say that they're customer oriented, are inside out thinkers. And it's a little bit of a play on words, right? Inside out, meaning they're thinking about things internally and projecting them back out to the market, right? You talked about the voice of the customer that your marketing guest talked about. Listen to customers. They'll tell you the words they use in terms of what they're looking for. And great marketers aren't proud about coming up with a smarter word or a better word. They just listen and they use the words that customers use over and over again in the way they engage those customers. And like, surprise, surprise, that's what drives lead volume. It's what drives customer retention and satisfaction. Listen, customers will tell you how to talk to them. They'll tell you how to meet them where they need to be met. So it is all about the customer.
There probably shouldn't be a sales conversation that ever happens without a draw and a reference to our own customer base, right? And the learning that comes out of that. That's what they want to learn. That's what they want to know. People like me that have done this before me, what have they learned? How have they benefited, right? What are the problems that they found and how did you overcome them? Like, that's what they really want to know. And that means you're drawing on the well of the voice of the customer. And if there's not a well to draw on there, then you're going to be playing the game with one hand tied behind your back.
Yeah, we decided a year ago, Steve, that 80% of the press releases we do in the market are going to be telling the stories of our customers, right? Like it's so easy to want to like tell people that you're launching a new product or you're hiring a new executive. First of all, nobody's all that excited about press releases anyway, but customers love when we go tell their stories and talk about the success they've had leveraging, in our case, our software. But we're mostly issuing press releases that tell the stories of our customers because that's what we're proudest of.
I see a second podcast coming here because I've got about 500 more questions to ask, but I know there's going to be questions that come in. And is it appropriate if we give out a link to your LinkedIn profile so people could reach out
Oh, of
and
course.
reach you?
Yep. Very happy to do that.
Well, so here's the thing. The mission of this podcast is to do one thing very well. It's talk to C-suite executives, B2B C-suite executives from all over the world, because whether you're a CMO, a CRO, a CFO, a CEO, you have responsibility outside of your functional area to grow the business. And so those are the conversations we love to have. And if we can take everyone's individual experiences and perceptions and insights and perspectives and bring them all together, then that's the rising tide that lifts all boats. And you were amazing today and being a part of that
Well,
rising
thank you.
tide.
I love doing this and it's great talking to somebody who's got customer at the core of their podcast. So thanks for inviting me, Steve.